And we're live. My name is Ted. You're watching the Business of Cyber Show. This is episode 18, where we talk about cybersecurity resources. We're talking about people, we're talking about time, and we're talking about overall budget. We never have enough of these resources. The world is becoming a little bit darker of a place day in and day out, and security and risk management leaders on the OT and the IT sides of the house have a lot on their collective shoulders right now. We're going to be diving into what I consider maybe a hallmark, maybe a foundation of the overall cybersecurity picture for critical infrastructure, and that's a deep dive into NIST. Okay, as we look at the number of folks that are online, it's super exciting to see. I don't know, about 150 of you, and so I can see on my end any comments that you put down. If you're okay with me sharing the comment with the collective group or with the question, go ahead and annotate that so that I can put it on the slide. This is a generally shorter series than we've had because it's just me talking today. Excited to talk about NIST CSF, why it's, in my perspective, the most widely used framework across the United States, why it's being implemented on a regular basis, and maybe some of the challenges that people have with it, maybe some of the great things that I like about it. The intent is that somebody can walk away. If you're a novice, you can generally know where to go to figure out, should NIST CSF, regardless of the different version, regardless of how deep you use it, should this be something that I should learn a little bit more about? And for those of us that might be a little bit more experienced, what are some different things that we might take away from this to implement back at our own job? So super excited. I'm starting to see some comments come through. Looking forward to diving in. With that, let's get into the overall slide deck. So I put some slides together. Some of these are from different presentations that I've done in the past. Some of them I came up with. Some of them I got off of the NIST CSF website. So let me just go real quick just to verify. If you just do a NIST CSF, if you just do a NIST CSF search online, you're going to find the organization that has tons and tons and tons of the documents that I'm using, as well as tutorial videos, as well as different Excel files. So just look NIST CSF up in your Google browser, and you're going to be able to find every single thing that I'm using today to talk about. You're going to be able to find it in your own way. So as we look at what we're going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. There's some things about NIST CSF that are functionally different and fundamentally different than some of the other organizations that build standards. We're going to talk about the core itself, which is where 95% of the people spend the majority of their time. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the implementation tiers. To me, the implementation tiers are something that people don't use enough of. And we're going to talk about what the authors of NIST CSF actually designed and implement. We'll talk a little bit. We're not going to talk about the actual profiles because, well, we'll get there in a minute. And then I want to show you a little bit of a case study. So for some of you that are already asking, yes, this session will be recorded. It'll be available on my LinkedIn, as long as LinkedIn wants to keep it. So looking forward to it. Send your questions and I look forward to diving into them. So a little bit about the overall history of NIST CSF, right? So when we think about just the foundational cybersecurity assessment, you've got, now I'm speaking to the novices here, you've got a ton of cyber controls. And those cyber controls are things that you should implement depending on what sector you're a part of, depending on what kind of company you're a part of. Those different controls are generally assessed on a regular basis by a security team. And to do that, they kind of need a recipe of success. They need an encyclopedia. And so there's literally hundreds of frameworks, standards, governance profiles, and different methodologies that you can use. NIST CSF is the most widely used, and it's good to understand kind of why. Well, the first is there was an executive order, I think it was in 2014, that said improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity was important to the United States. And so NIST, which has been around for years and years and years and years, took it on the responsibility of actually building that out. And so once the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2014 came out, it became law. And then an executive order that continued to come out in 2017 continued to offer the resources necessary to put really smart people in a room, connect with people from the asset owner space, whether it's a manufacturing company, whether it's an oil and gas company, whether it's a company that makes computers. These are really critical for the way we conduct commerce as a country. Also tied in with folks from major universities and also tied in with U.S. government as well as other governments. What most people do not know is that NIST is a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Now, this is one of the first reasons that I really like NIST CSF. Now, when you think about U.S. Department of Commerce, you're like, what does that really mean? So it's not it's not really a technical organization. It's not a threat organization. It's an organization whose sole purpose is to make sure that the standards that it provides add value both domestically and internationally. Well, we take a step deeper. When I was doing the research for this particular episode, I focused a lot on the who and the why of NIST. And one of the things that I found was this mission statement. Now I'm going to read it verbatim. NIST's mission is to develop and promote measurement standards and technology to enhance productivity, facilitate trade, and improve the quality of life. Now, if you take nothing out of the Business of Cyber show, what I would like you to take away is, if the mission of the organization that is driving a cyber standard or the alignment to a cyber standard, if their mission is to enhance productivity, facilitate trade, and improve quality of life, then what we're going to find is a set of standards, a set of governance requirements, a set of rules, a set of recommendations that are actually nested into a much bigger picture. And this is the first kind of thing that I think NIST CSF does really well, is that it's written in a way that you can nest the core objectives or the core recommendations or the core end state of cybersecurity controls. You can map it all the way back up to a larger mission. And that's what NIST does really well. That's not to take away from some other groups, agencies, standards bodies that have built something extremely specific. On the contrary, I think NIST CSF sets a really great foundation of an understanding where your cyber control posture really sits, which then allows you to go a little bit deeper. So I'm just going to take a moment here and take a look at all these questions. Okay, perfect. I think we're all caught up. So I really liked that. I think that one of the things that when I talk to CISOs, when I talk to OT security leaders, the biggest thing that I always talk about is generally resources, but it's resources as it relates to the business context of the organization. It's hard to subscribe to a really specific risk or controls-based methodology. It's really hard as an organization to subscribe to one product or one service or one solution, because the underlying business of a given company in a given sector has its own mission priorities. That's why we see when you align your cybersecurity investment to safety, when you align your cybersecurity investment to operational uptime, we start to see a little bit more alignment between the operational folks and the cybersecurity folks. I think NIST CSF creates the foundation to do that really effectively. So I just wanted to share kind of a couple things that you may not know. Now, when you actually look at how NIST CSF was written, what you're going to find is it's designed to be super simple. So the actual language used throughout the NIST CSF, which, if I'm not mistaken, I pulled it up, I think it's about 48 pages. Just for context, it's about 48 pages from the very top title of 1.1 all the way to the last page. That 1.1 was released in 2018. There's actually a version 2 that is out for comment right now, which adds another layer called governance. We're not going to dive into that today. We're going to be focused on 1.1. And 1.1 is designed to be very simple, easy to understand. You don't need a master's degree in cybersecurity to understand what it's trying to say. It's also, which most people don't know, it's 1000% designed to be customizable. And I'll talk about when and how and should people customize NIST CSF shortly. If I don't, somebody please comment, because that's where I think the number one way a security leader, a security consultant can actually drive value to the organization is taking something like NIST CSF and then making it applicable to an organization. And then finally, it's a bigger discussion, but the word risk assessment is actually not, in my opinion, other people might disagree, it's actually not taking NIST CSF and assessing to all those outcomes. We're actually going to get into the prescribed methodology that the authors of NIST CSF want an organization or recommend that an organization follow. And you'd be surprised at where the word assessment is used. Bottom line is that the NIST CSF 48-page document that continues to be refined is a very simple to understand, easy to read document that outlines desirable outcomes for a host of different company types. So whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're baking bread, whether you're in metals manufacturing, whether you're a chemical company, or whether you're a bank, if you apply principles to achieve the outcomes designated as important in NIST CSF, or at least the majority of them, you're on the road to a more secure organization. And I think that there does not exist a framework or a standard that is as encompassing from a depth perspective and wide perspective, as also which gives you the flexibility to implement. So for the novices out there, bottom line, NIST CSF tells you in a couple short ways, here's what you're supposed to be doing, and this is how it does it. I'm going to go right into this. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to go backwards. So, well, it's actually, let's not go right into that. I'm going to go back a little bit. So NIST CSF is broken up into 3 parts. The core is a series of outcomes that have been broken down into categories and subcategories. I'll give you an example of them in a minute. It is aligned by a certain number of controls that kind of fit together in that core, and there's 5 domains for that. The profiles are a really unique thing that I think NIST has not really had a lot of adoption on. And what it is it's where I know that I've actually on this show presented the manufacturing profile. And what it says is you could take NIST CSF 108 controls, and you can apply those controls and the meaningfulness of those controls directly to a business outcome. In one case, it could be maximize uptime. In one case, it could be reduce safety or reduce safety incidents. In one case, it could be maximize the production out of facility A versus facility B. What NIST CSF authors intended to do, and they intend people to do, is to take this profile, at least as an example, and do what the Business of Cyber show has always said, is take your cybersecurity risk reduction investments, tie it to a business outcome. I don't think people do that a lot. I don't think they do it well. I think that that's what the industry needs more than ever. And we're going to uncover a couple of the reasons why. One of the things that I think NIST CSF does extremely well is what we call implementation tiers. Now, that's a kind of a qualitative measure of how effectively an organization is able to essentially take in new information as it's on its cyber journey and then reapply it to make itself better. It's almost in a self-healing capacity. And what NIST CSF does really well is that they offer out some numerical tiers. And we're going to go through a case study of where I've seen the implementation tiers work really well. When people talk about NIST CSF, 95% of the time, they're going to be talking about the core. Now, the core is in that 48-page document. It will list out every single one of your different controls and the control categories and the families and domains. And then even beyond that, it's going to actually teach you some informative references. And they're all laid out into, some people say functions, I say actually domains. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Let me see if I can move this little guy so you can see the whole thing. So within each of these colored from the blue down to the green, what you're going to find are a series of statements that are related to an outcome that are specifically designed to be understandable by everybody in your organization to achieve a certain outcome. And NIST CSF is written in a way that it's open and up to interpretation enough that you can customize it, but it is specific enough that very few people could doubt the intent of the authorship. And this is where a lot of challenges are introduced into the cybersecurity world. It's this theory-oriented, risk-oriented, likelihood-oriented approach. And I want to be very clear. The risk methodology that a given asset owner, a given owner of a business, a given owner of an IT or OT, the likelihood, the risk, the impact of that, those are not covered inside of a NIST CSF. What is covered inside of NIST CSF are the desired outcomes that a well-functioning cybersecurity organization, or an organization in general, to say even better, should be achieving to achieve a desired outcome. So what does that mean? Does that mean that if I go and assess myself to the entirety of the NIST CSF controls categories that I'm not doing a risk assessment? Can't answer that question. It depends on your theory and your definition of a risk assessment. If you say, am I doing a gap assessment because I'm assessing myself to a known number of controls? I think that probably falls on more positive ears globally. We've talked on this show a lot about the differences between risk and control-based assessments and audits. We talked about the difference between audits and assessments. The bottom line is it's up for you and your organization to determine the how. What NIST CSF does really well is it tells you what you should really be focused on as it relates to the breadth of cybersecurity controls that you could be attacking. So let's dive in a little bit more. So in purple, you'll see that this function is the protect function. It's broken down, those 5 functions, if you look at the bottom of the screen, are broken down into 23 categories, which are then broken up into 108 subcategories. And then I'm going to hold on the informative references on the right. When you go and take a look at a NIST CSF, you're going to see in those 48 pages, you're going to see a category called, in this particular space, identity management, authentication, and access control, which is actually an updated version of 1.1 because it used to be, if I'm not identity management. And then the subcategories are where we get into what we call controls, right? So are you identifying X? Are you doing Y? Do you have a system for E? Those are the things that you're going to find in the subcategories, which roll up to the categories, which roll up to the functions. Now, on this show, I've actually talked about the importance of consultants and product companies within the cyberspace narrowing their focus on a few categories and subcategories and doing those extremely well in order to be differentiated in the market. We see a lot of different companies who say, ineffectively, that all controls are solved by my product or my service. And the truth is it's not true. You need a layered defense in depth and webbed approach to implement a lot of different policies and procedures, a lot of different services, and a lot of different tooling to create the web, if you will, of cyber control closures and defenses in order to effectively protect yourself against whatever threats that are out there. So what this framework core does really effectively is it says, look, these are the different controls inside of this category or function. And in this case, it's protect. Now, I wanted to show you another one. This one is supply chain risk management. And one of the things that I really like about NIST CSF is that with NIST CSF, it talks about a very basic set of languages. And in this particular case, I learned this from actually some speakers from the NIST organization. It was pretty incredible how they thought about this. When you study the NIST CSF document, you will find very easy to understand language. And a perfect example of that is when they're talking about this supply chain category, supply chain risk, some people call it third party, they use identify, assess, and manage. Pretty easy to understand words. Nobody's going to really argue about what it means to identify your third-party risk, to assess your third-party risk, and to manage your third-party risk, but it doesn't tell you the how. It doesn't even get into the why. If you believe that third-party risk or supply chain risk is an issue to your business, then NIST CSF gives you at least a starting point on what should be done. And that's where the subcategories come in. Now, if we go a little bit bigger, let's see if we can see this. So what is this informative references on the right-hand side? This is one of the coolest things about NIST CSF is they recognize that there does exist risk assessment methodology specific to a domain, specific to a function, specific to a sector. And so what you'll see is whether it's ISO 62443, whether it's COBIT, whether it's CIS controls, whether it's ISO 27000, whether it's another part of NIST, they've actually given you a reference to this same subcategory control in another document. And in that other document, you will find more clarity on the how and the why. And so that would be like if you're baking a cake and it says use a certain type of flour or use a little bit, this much flour, then what it's going to tell you is in that informative references, that's where you're going to go get the nutrition facts. That's where you're going to go figure out how much it costs. That's where you're going to go figure out exactly what kind I want to use to achieve a different flavor. And so NIST CSF has positioned itself not as the end-all be-all standard for you to follow. What it has done very effectively, and I hope it continues to in the future, is people that move forward with a risk-based methodology like or zones and conduits methodology for OT, like a ISO 62443 3-2. There are fundamental data models that are required to conduct that risk assessment that you can't get right out of the gate if you start with a risk-based methodology. You have to understand what your overall controls posture is. You have to understand what your threat posture is. You have to understand what your risk and the likelihood. Those are 4 different data models that you really have to have in place with some element of assurance, some element of data, some element of congruence in order for you to move to a risk-based methodology approach. NIST CSF knows that. All NIST CSF has done is it has said, look, here are all the controls that 90% or 88% or 100% of the different risk methodologies are going to require anyway. So think of NIST CSF as a fundamental building block for a risk-based methodology or a risk-based assessment that you would do later. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about that right now. If you want these slides afterwards, what I did is I basically broke down identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. I feel like where we're at with time, I'm not going to go into each one unless someone asks and needs it. What I'd rather do is talk about how NIST CSF, and I want to give you the exact page number if I can. NIST CSF has a recommendation of how you should implement NIST CSF, or the authors put it in there. Let me just see if I can find the page real quick. So if you are inside of 1.1, you are going to go to page, just be patient with me, section 3. Section 3.2, establishing or improving a cybersecurity program. Now, I'm going to start talking about the actual how do you go and do this first, okay? So we talked a little bit about the core. We'll talk about implementation tiers in a minute. We talked a little bit about the different domains and functions, okay? So there does exist a catalog of cybersecurity outcomes. We know that there's informative references tied to that, but how do we actually go and start it? So I find a lot of dichotomy in how people are approaching how do you do, let's say, how do you use NIST CSF? I even want to hesitate from using the word assessment because the authors of NIST CSF were very clear that establishing your current profile is what I think the majority of the world would call a NIST CSF assessment. So every one of the bullets that is on the screen right now, every one of the bullets that's on the screen is actually mapped to section 3.2 on page 14 of the NIST CSF 1.1 doc. Now I'm gonna read a little bit just so we're clear. When it says prioritize and scope, it's talking about aligning your business and your mission to an area of the company. If you go and say, I'm going to do NIST CSF across my 10,000 person organization, you're probably not going to get to the level of granularity or specificity that you need. And so where you want to have a scope of systems and assets, this is where it gets probably the first complicated piece when you roll out NIST CSF is how wide am I going to go and who's going to be answering the questions about whether those subcategories of controls are in place. So if we just think about a chemical company, you could apply NIST CSF to the company at the corporate level, but you could also apply NIST CSF in a foundational level at each specific site because each specific site may or may not have the people, the process, and the technology in place to illuminate whether or not that control is established. So I'm always a believer in try to go to the facility level, the business unit level, wherever there is essentially a fence of people, process, and budget for you to actually implement fixes and controls. That's pretty easy. The next is orient. So when you once the scope of the cybersecurity program has been determined for the business line, the organization identifies related systems, regulatory requirements, to overall risk approach, then consults to identify. I mean, I don't really think there's much to be, you're orienting on a certain type of systems. You're making sure that you're incorporating any sort of regulatory guidance and things like that. This is where it starts to get a little tricky. Just out of curiosity, what do you think it means by profile, then risk assessment, then target profile? To most people, skip over the profile, they move right to risk assessment, and then they immediately go in implementing action plans. What NIST CSF authors actually decided that they wanted to do is that utilizing the subcategories of controls and evaluating the current state of your company against those controls is what it calls profile. So create a current profile. The organization develops a current profile by indicating which category and subcategory outcomes from the framework core are currently being achieved. Now just stop right there. That means you have those 108 controls and you're looking at yourself, your organization, and you're saying, do I have those controls effectively in place? NIST CSF authors said that's establishing your primary profile. The world, I'll just tell you right now, pulls from solutions, it pulls from Excel files, it pulls from books, and it says, I'm going to, quote, assess myself to the NIST CSF framework, and whether or not I have those certain controls, I'm going to grade myself. I'm not saying one is wrong or right. What I'm saying is that most people don't understand, especially naysayers who believe that NIST CSF may not be in depth enough to be considered a risk methodology. It was never the intent of the NIST CSF authors to be a risk methodology. And here's how I can tell you that is because step 4 is to take any data that you have incorporating an overall risk management process or of a previous risk assessment, taking a look at the operational environment, take a look at the likelihood of cyber attacks, take a look at any threat feeds that you have. You really have to go in and do a true blue risk assessment. What's the worst thing that could happen to my organization based on all the threats and the likelihood that those threats are going to be able to impact my business operations? That is a risk assessment. They do not include cyber in the risk assessment part, except for 2 places: cyber threats and cybersecurity event. So when you think about an event and a threat, those rarely have to be cyber oriented. You can have a threat come from people. You can have a threat come from a supply chain. You can have a cybersecurity event. The event can actually be some sort of business impact. So I think it's very important to note, most people don't know this, and the CSF never, in my opinion, intended to be a risk management framework, but rather establish with these subcontrol outcomes that we recommend a profile. Then separately, go do a risk assessment. And then use one of the implementation tiers to create a target profile that will look at all of your categories. It'll look at all of your subcategories, and you ask yourself, what are the desired outcomes that I want to have? These 3 things are totally unrelated. You establish a profile by yourself. You establish a risk assessment, and then you go back and you say, okay, to reduce the overall risk assessment, what does my outcome really want to be? And that's where we jump into the determine, analyze, and prioritize gaps. This is where I think NIST CSF wanted organizations to spend more time. And from my vantage point out on the battlefield, people don't spend a lot of time doing this. They don't really compare their current profile against their target profile, incorporate in some level of risk assessment to introduce the likelihood that that thing is going to happen. This control that I don't have, if I put this control in place, it'll stop that attack, or it'll at least be a mechanism of defense against it. Kind of collaborating on those 3, current state, future state, realistic state, it's not done very effectively. Hold on, somebody's telling me LinkedIn has a problem. What, they can't hear me? Just stand by, guys. Seems LinkedIn is having an issue on there and people cannot get into the live. I imagine the views are dropping because of it. It's not on us. It's a LinkedIn problem. Well, I'm going to continue mission like we didn't have a technical difficulty today, and hopefully you'll be able to see this later. Bottom line is that what most people do is they assume that with the NIST CSF that they're doing a risk assessment when really they're just assessing themselves against a known number of controls or identifying their gaps. And then they're jumping way over to implementing the action plan. And here's how it looks on real paper. Vendor comes in, conducts some level of assessment, showcases everything is red to you, and then immediately puts a purchase order in front of you to solve whatever reds they can fix with their product. You buy it, you feel better at night, you come back a year later, and you ask yourself, am I really more secure? That's what the industry's doing. That's why Business Cyber Show exists, is because there aren't enough dollars, there isn't enough time to implement, dollars to buy, people to manage a fix to every one of the subcategory controls for a given organization. Let me repeat that. I don't think there's a CISO on earth that I've met or that I haven't met yet who would disagree that if you did a gap assessment, a threat risk assessment, as well as a target profile assessment of where you want to be, you have to close up all these gaps. There's not enough budget to buy the solutions. There's not enough time to implement them all. And there's not enough qualified personnel to actually manage that process. So what happens is we have to be looking at, if we really want to drive a deeper usage of NIST CSF, we have to understand what the authors wanted. And the authors are saying this is a continual process. And there must be the same amount of time, people, and budget pushed towards determining a target profile, conducting that risk assessment, analyzing the data, and then implementing an action plan as there is to just buy the solution and implement it. Now, what I see a lot of people do is they will know, because they've been in their business for a really long time, they'll know what their top controls are that they want to solve. And they'll actually take NIST CSF and they'll reverse engineer the controls gap profile evaluation. And they will assess themselves to that known standard. And I think that's an excellent solution. You see people doing this with CIS controls. You see people doing this a lot when it's a controls-based methodology. They'll say, look, we're going to do something in identify, we're going to do something in detect, we're going to do something in recover. And that's what we're spending our resources on this year. We're going to get that into maintenance mode, and then next year we're going to come back. So do you have to assess to all 108 controls at every one of your facilities every single month or every single year or every other year? That's for you to determine. What is important is to note that the version 1.1 implements a healthy level of flexibility for you to take a subcategory, twist it a little bit, edit it a little bit, or to just remove some subcategories that you don't think are applicable. Taking a look here. I do think we've had a drop in people, but we're going to keep rolling. Now, the one thing that I do want to talk about is we talked about the core. We talked a little bit about the methodology that NIST CSF authors wanted you to follow. We talked about some of the things that the industry actually does instead. Let's talk about one of the most widely misunderstood items, I think, in NIST CSF, and that's the implementation tiers. So the core was actually developed in association with the implementation tiers in this one way. Let me see if I can make this bigger. They give you... Did I delete the slide? Looks like I deleted it. They give you 4 different tiers, numbered 1 through 4, which are partial, risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive. And what it does is it asks you a series of questions about how you are. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you telling me you can still hear me. Risk management process, integrated risk management process, and external participation. How well data is coming from your cybersecurity program to your risk management process, how much you're integrating that data into an integrated risk management process, and how much the external outside of your company data models are either being sent or received. Let me dive into this a little bit. If you're a partial tier 1 implementation, when it comes to risk management, there's no process. It's all ad hoc. Hey, we have this vulnerability. We got to patch it tomorrow. When you think about how much your decisions about that control closure get tied into a larger integrated risk management discussion, very, very limited. And finally, does that site in Buenos Aires actually talk to the corporate site and follow some sort of change management, some sort of budgeting approval process? Does it work with any of the local vendors? No, it's a site in a vacuum. Now we go all the way down to level 4 where we're truly adaptive. Let's walk through the same questions and see how those respond. The risk management process is in number 3 is policy driven. Means that if there's going to be a change or we're going to do something, there's a policy that governs it. If you move up to a level 4, that means that you are actually incorporating lessons learned from the last time. So what we see is adaptive organizations are able to incorporate even more than following a policy. They're improving upon the policy. When it comes to your integrated risk management process, they're connecting cyber to actual business, okay? When you look at number 3, the repeative, those are people are actually understanding cyber. And when you look at external participation, when people are a level 3 implementation tier, they're collaborating with others. Maybe that is some sort of threat intel sharing forum. Maybe that is some sort of platform where you're sharing things. And maybe it's some sort of integration with other facilities globally. Bottom line, if you thought about your value to an organization, if you thought about where you sit in an organization, generally if you're in the cyberspace, you may have hundreds, maybe even thousands of people that you work to left and right. I challenge you to think about, for a given facility, for a given corporate infrastructure, if you had to point at what tier you are today, it really doesn't, you could probably do it just by thinking, am I in a position where I'm doing everything ad hoc, or am I in a position where I am constantly improving on our own processes? What I appreciate about the authorship of NIST CSF is that this same implementation tiers can be applied with zero change to the language, with the exception of the word cyber, to a lot of other different functions of critical sectors. You could apply it to safety. You could apply it to physical security. You could apply it to risk. You could apply it to safety events. You could apply it to quality control. You could even apply it to how a given organization manages the health of its employees. So I just want you to take that in for a second and recognize that once again, we have NIST, whose mission is to make essentially all organizations more profitable, more, I can't remember the words, but more valuable to their own ecosystems. The authors of NIST CSF want the users to do the same thing. Most organizations do not implement the implementation tiers. Let me show you how this could be used in real world. Case study for a chemical sector. Starting from top left, I'm going to go bottom right for a second. You got 100 facilities across the US, Asia, and Europe. They got $1 billion in revenue. They got a relatively small team size. They got 10 or 12 folks on their cyber team, and they're relatively young in their maturity, but they got a lot of support from the C-suite. So this particular enterprise has a really low level of resources, but they're able to build a world-class cyber program because they're aligning NIST CSF implementation tiers to their business risk. Now, what you see here is that at some point, someone came in and started to map out the scope. They started to map out the business context. They started to map out the business importance of all their different facilities. And so on the first column that you see is the facility criticality. They got low criticality offices, they have medium criticality offices, and then they have high criticality offices. And those offices could be chemical sites that are revenue generating. The medium sites could be kind of supply facilities that are feeding raw materials in. And so it's a very important function of the business, but if something happened to that specific medium criticality supply facility, the whole business isn't going to shut down. The whole P&L is not going to be rocked. It might affect the output later down the road, but it's not going to be as critical as one of the high paying moneymakers. Now, what they simply did is they said, we are going to have 10 of our facilities that are all low be partial on the implementation tiers. We're going to have all 25 of our medium facilities be risk informed, and we're going to spend the majority of our resources on the highs. And so when you look at going right back up from this implementation tier, when you go back to this here, I'm focused on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The target profile is different for the various business units or chemical facilities based on their value to the overall organization, which means that if I'm going to establish a target profile of 1, 2, 3, or 4, I'm actually choosing the desired outcomes from the framework core that I want implemented effectively, which means that out of the 108 subcategories of controls, the highs may get 90 of those controls closed with some sort of tool, technology, policy, or process, or training, whereas the 10 may only get 12. And right there is really the foundation of what we talk about all the time on this particular show. And that is, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough budget, and we don't have enough time to implement everything. How do we move forward as a collective body of security and risk management leaders to actually spending our resources wisely? NIST CSF offers within its homegrown, fully available online version an understanding of the various controls that are recommended globally across a swath of different sectors. And it also incorporates a tool in the implementation tiers that will help you guide the way you're thinking about your overall cybersecurity risk management. If you are a consultant out there and you're looking to dive a little bit deeper value to your business, I would recommend the implementation tiers be a be a very big component of how you go to assess, how you go to talk to your clients, because they're going to trust you more if you think about their wallet and their time. If you're a product company, I think you've got to focus 1000% of your effort on saying these are the exact controls or the subcategories of controls out of NIST CSF that we solve. And here's the impact if we don't solve them for our critical facilities. As CISOs out there, the implementation tiers and the core are available to you. There's thousands of people out there that can twist and effectively edit, if you will, a risk management approach for your company. There's a positive correlation with your savings of time, people, and money, and the knowledge base that you have of NIST CSF. Because if you know very effectively how to implement a thought process about creating your own profile, conducting a risk assessment, and then creating a target profile, and then analyzing the data accordingly, you're probably going to save a lot of money because you're going to recognize not everything is necessary. Bottom line, happy to take any questions that you have. This has been fun talking about NIST CSF. I appreciate the time. I don't know how many people joined. We're stopped at 41 minutes, but this has been a joy to talk to you about. I hope that you gain value from it, and we look forward to seeing you on episode 19. Have a wonderful day.